right. I appreciate the enthusiasm. This is going to be a fun night. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural, what I'll call Planning Department Board and Commission Summit. We've got a full agenda, so I'm going to dispense with the typical pleasantries at the start of the meeting and dive right into the program in hopes that we get out of here at a reasonable hour. So let me start off by introducing myself, and the evening will unfold from there. So I'm Ben Franco. I'm a Brookline resident. I've been on the select board for nearly 6 years, and I have been involved in development in Brookline to varying degrees over the past 10 years. Among my development engagements was my past chairmanship of the River Road Study Committee about 4 years ago with a number of people in this room. And that committee, that River Road Study Committee, successfully proposed the creation of an overlay district at the industrial island at the intersection of Brookline Avenue, Washington Street, and River Road. And there's some construction activity unfolding there. And the building is looking more and more ready for occupancy each day. So in my role as a select board member and as the past chair of that committee, I bring a perspective to this conversation of sort of a top-down view. And by that I mean I sit on top of the approval process along with my colleagues here on the board, and I see and hear about projects that are proposed across town and across neighborhoods. And I'm also the person, again, along with my colleagues, that gets the calls about why is the process so onerous and why is it so protracted. Now, the majority of you are a cross-section of the boards and commissions that oversee development and land use in this town. And you do that at two levels. One, at an operational level. That means that you give or withhold permissions to undertake specific actions. For example, you say, yes, you can install those windows or that driveway or build that building. Or you say, no, that building's too close to the edge of a property, or the paint color is inappropriate. And you also operate at a strategic level. And by that I mean you think about how the town should be prepared for the future and how to respond to trends that we're observing. So for example, what types of uses are right for a property or a part of town? What should a homeowner be allowed to do without receiving specific permission or without more specific vetting? So your perspective is specific to issues, preservation or economic development, for example, or to individual properties or products. So we've checked off the first item in this agenda. I'm now going to talk a little bit about acknowledgements and move on to a more comprehensive view of the development, planning, and permitting process in Brookline. So I want to acknowledge first my colleagues up here on the rostrum with me, my colleagues on the select board, Bernard Green, our chair, Nancy Heller, Heather Hamilton, and Raul Fernandez. I want to acknowledge town staff who have taken time out of their busy lives to extend their workday to be here in the evening. And you'll hear from many of them during the course of this program. But I want to take a special moment to recognize the town administrator, Mel Kleckner, who's in the back of the room, and thank him for joining us this evening. I also want to thank all of you and acknowledge you, board and commission members who have come out tonight to participate in this conversation. I understand there's a lot going on, and I know many of your groups are meeting more frequently and for longer just to keep up with your assigned portfolios. So I appreciate you all making time to be here this evening. And I want to thank members of the public who have joined us as well. While this evening has mostly been structured to allow for information exchange between boards and commissions, it's important that everybody, both inside and outside of government, understand what's happening and where conversations can occur between elected, appointed, and grass-top leaders. And in that spirit, we're going to, let me go through the agenda in a little bit more detail here. So we've started with welcome and introductions. We're going to then move on, as I mentioned, to an example about permitting and developing in Brookline. We'll hear from the planning department staff about strategies, policies, projects, and program work. We'll then have the first of our two question and answer sessions. This first one's specific to questions for planning department staff. Then we'll hear updates from board and commission chairs, and then we will have a second question and answer session. This second one specific to board and commissions, and then we will wrap up a little bit and talk about next steps. Let me pause here and just talk a little bit about how we're going to run these question and answer sessions. There are note cards that will be distributed by EDAB volunteers, and I ask that you write legibly short questions and hand those back to the volunteers. I'm then going to be handed the questions, and as time allows, pose those questions to the relevant person or persons. I'm going to give preference to questions and themes that come up multiple times and focus on those issues that fall within the scope of this conversation, this evening's conversations. And if I don't ask your question, I apologize in advance. I want to, at this moment, before I close out the gratitudes, by expressing thanks to Ken Lewis, who organized tonight's session. I know all of you share the experience that I had of being bird dogged to deliver remarks or PowerPoint slides, so he certainly was an able taskmaster and did yeoman's work getting us all in the same room. Let me talk a little bit about meeting objectives quickly. We've got 4 objectives here this evening. To educate board members about what everybody else is doing in town. So that's to talk about the roles of boards and commissions, to talk about who works in the planning department and what they do, and to give a holistic view of the Brookline planning process. Second goal is to improve coordination between boards and commissions and break down the silos that I think too often plague us. The third goal is to hear from planning staff about their view of the landscape. So what trends do we see across boards and commissions? What planning strategies or frameworks might be worth exploring here in Brookline, and then to preview projects that might be in queue and talk a little bit about how we can get out in front of development trends. And then the fourth goal, finally, is to hear from board and commissions via their chairs about recent accomplishments and initiatives and priorities, and do a little bit of an assessment of strengths and weaknesses. Let me talk a little bit about why we're holding this meeting, and then I'll quickly move into the example that I've previewed a couple of times now. With that housekeeping covered, let me turn to what I think the foundational question is of why we're all sitting here. And the answer to that question of why we're holding this meeting is because development in Brookline is complicated. And from my perspective, the folks in this room share responsibility for overseeing development in Brookline. And my observation is that we all know there's other boards and commissions in town that need to weigh in on a proposal, but we don't have a sense of what that development process looks like from the applicant's standpoint. And I hope that this evening is going to get us closer to solving that overarching problem. And I know there's excitement in this room about this inaugural opportunity to have cross-cutting conversations. And I applaud that enthusiasm, but it's my job to try and keep this conversation at a level that pertains to everybody in the room and doesn't get too specific to the point where we're talking about issues or matters that only apply to a subset of us. So in that spirit, let me tick through some topics that I think are beyond the scope of tonight's conversation. We're not here to conduct a comprehensive land use planning workshop. The use of town facilities is beyond the scope of tonight's meeting, so no conversations about the 9th Elementary School, an appropriate siting, or adaptive reuse of the public health building, or thoughts about the highest and best use of the water department yard. We've got a subset of boards and commissions here, and you'll notice that there's not representation from the Parks and Rec Commission, and I don't believe the Conservation Commission either. So we're not going to talk about open space planning. And while we do have some representatives from the Transportation Board, we don't have time to get into the specifics of traffic circulation or the implementation of the town's complete streets plan. We're also going to steer clear of conversations about the expansion of nonprofit organizations in Brookline. That's a worthwhile conversation, but it deserves an evening in and of itself. And we're also going to steer clear of specific conversations about development policies. And then I think operational regulations and project conditions are also beyond the scope of this evening. So again, I'm going to try and keep us on task, and I ask for your help to steer the conversation to an appropriate level. So let's return to the question of why we're holding this meeting. Brookline's famous for its process, and I am convinced that given the opportunity, we'd form a committee to oversee the opening of an envelope. Please don't misunderstand me. I applaud process, and I think it's important that many of us acknowledge that we play a small role within the larger development and land use process, and that each of us sees as just a small portion of the larger process that people have to experience. And to underscore that point, I'm going to go through a humorous but accurate description of the process that a development project might go through from application to possible approval. So let's consider a scenario where a developer wishes to construct a multifamily residential apartment building with more than 16 DUs under the provisions of MGL Chapter 48. They would start by meeting with staff from the DPCD to review the requirements of the project as set forth in the town's ZBL. A key factor in the initial planning phase would involve determining if the proposed GFA divided by the square feet of their lot is below the maximum permitted FAR. The developer will also need to confirm on-site parking requirements and its impact on project scale. This determination would be made by a function of the number of BRs per DU, the mix of standard and HC spaces meeting ADA specifications, and project's applicable ZBL district. The developer would need to determine if the parking should be above or below grade, the former being less expensive, but counting against maximum FAR if the project is located within the CCDO district. The proposed development is greater than 16 DUs and would thus qualify as a major impact project. As a major impact project, it would require a special permit from the ZBA in its capacity as the SPGA. Prior to the issuance of a special permit, the PB would conduct a site plan and design review with assistance from an appointed DAT. If the MIP is located in an LHD, design review will also be required inside evaluation of its conformance with the design guidelines established by the PC. The PB and the DAT would provide the ZBA with recommendations for conditions to be included in the special permit. Any significant deviation from the ZBL would require a variance from the ZBA, which would only be granted upon demonstration of unique hardships. The HAB and housing planning staff, who are collectively responsible for planning HPP and oversight of the AHTF, would also be asked to confirm that the proposed project meets the requirements of the provision of the AHUs under the town's IZBL. The IZBL requirement could also be met on site if 10% of the AHUs are rented at 80% AMI monthly rates, and 5% of the AHUs are rented at 50% AMI monthly rates, consistent with the rent schedules established by HUD and by the MHP, with the utility adjustments determined by BHA. Alternatively, a developer could make cash in lieu contributions to the AHTF, provided the payment is equivalent to the difference in the value of AHUs provided on site and the FMV of units rented at market rates typically determined by DCF analysis. But if the town's SHI is below 10%, the developer should elect to pursue the MF project under MGL Chapter 40B. From the developer's perspective, the 40B option may be preferable to 40A when the permitted FAR in a zoning district, such as G1.75 or L1.0, is inadequate from the development to be financially feasible as measured by the projected ROC, ROI, and IRR. The 40B process would involve securing a PEL from the MHP and DHCD, then a comprehensive permit from the ZBA. The 40B development must include the provision of either 20% AHUs rented at 50% AMI monthly rates or 25% AHUs rented at 80% AMI monthly rates per the HUD and MHP rent schedule. However, from a fiscal perspective, the town would typically prefer a mixed-use development project that includes commercial and industrial property, here referred to as CIP, which is a tax rate that is 1.64 times the residential tax rate. If the CIP component includes a hotel, it also offers the additional fiscal benefit of room occupancy tax, which is equivalent to 6% of total room revenue. Room rates, number of rooms times RevPAR, RevPAR equaling the ADR times occupancy rate. To achieve a mixed-use TOD, EDAB, and ED staff may encourage the developer to seek approval for upzoning at the spring or fall town meeting. This could involve appointments of a land use study committee by the select board, formerly known as the BOS, which would be comprised of representatives from the neighborhood development boards and TMMs from adjacent precincts. The committee would evaluate the development site and may propose a warrant article to amend the ZBL. This was the process that the River Road Study Committee and the Coolidge Corner Study Committee followed, that resulted in the adoption of the Emerald Island Overlay District and the Waldo-Durgan Overlay District, respectively. The proposed warrant article would require public hearings before the advisory committee and 2/3 of town meetings approval. Concurrent with the ZBL amendment, the select board, with guidance from EDAB and economic development staff, would typically negotiate a 99-year tax certainty agreement, a TCA, would require a pilot equal to the full AV should the property be sold to a tax-exempt nonprofit entity such as a hospital based in the Longwood medical area. It should also be noted that upzoning districts in proximity to the MBTA stops in order to incentivize TOD is also a recommendation of the recent BFAC report. An increase in permitted density could also be a critical component of ED strategy to help the town maintain the Standard & Poor's AAA bond rating, as falling to AA rating would increase the town's annual borrowing cost by 25 BPS. Evaluation of all major development proposals would include a peer-reviewed traffic impact study approved by TD staff. The TIS would analyze the projected AADT generated from the proposed new development project in regards to its impact on the LOS of key adjacent intersections and its accommodation of safe pedestrians and bike access, consistent with the town's complete street plan adopted by the TB. The TDM plan would be required to mitigate impacts, which often include offering employees discounted passes on the MBTA. In the unlikely scenario, the development plan required wetland mitigation. It would also be subject to site plan review by the TCC and Tom Brady, which is the town's conservation officer, not to be confused with TB12, otherwise known as the GOAT, who we hope will continue as the quarterback of the New England Patriots next year. The CC enforces the town's wetland protection bylaw, the WPBL, through its issuance of a DOA, an OOC, a COC, and if necessary, EOs. Before proceeding with construction, the developer would need to obtain a demolition permit from the town. The permit would also be subject to review by the PC and the preservation planning staff. The PC could recommend the demolition be delayed, especially if the property is on the National Register. If the developer proposes to immediately demolish a property that's on the National Register, it would likely be SOL. However, developer need not be concerned with regulations under an NCD, as these were summarily rejected by the Superior Court as DOA. Finally, this town has a goal to be sustainable and to reduce its CO2 footprint by 2050. To that end, the CAC has promoted sustainability measures for new development, including the stretch building code and incorporating LEED certifiable standards and EUI targets in development agreements. And if the AG approves warrant article 21 passed at the fall town meeting, amending the GBL, future developments must utilize fossil fuel free infrastructure, but that's TBD. In conclusion, We're pleased to have in attendance this evening representatives from boards, including the Select Board, formerly known as the BOS, the PB, the HAB, EDAB, the ZBA, and TB, committees including the CAC, the AC, the ZBLRC, the RRSC, the CCSC, and BFAC, commissions including PC, CC, and BC, and authorities, the BHA, along with DPCD staff to help us better understand and coordinate this sometimes complicated process. I will note that the meeting has been duly advertised per the requirements of the OML, and that we have an agenda, so we should proceed with that ASAP. All right, I want to thank Ken Lewis and Kara Bruton for pulling that example together. Clearly, it was a long example, but I think it was a little over the top and funny. But if you got lost, good. That was the point. But I really want to underscore the salient point here that let's not lose sight of why we find humor in that example, and it's because. Part of the reason that we find humor is because, at some level, we're all uncomfortable with the number of acronyms and how extensive the process is. And as we proceed with the rest of the night, I just ask that you keep in mind that if we're all confused and we think it's a little bit onerous, imagine how John Q. Public feels when he or she walks into the planning department or attends successive meetings at which a project is discussed. So with that in mind, it's now time to turn it over to Allison Steinfeld, our planning director here in Brookline, who's going to kick off the staff planning section of the meeting.
Thank you very much. That's certainly a hard act to follow. Obviously, the planning department is very pleased to participate in this, and also want to acknowledge Ken Lewis out there for not only conceiving of this forum, but for working so hard to pull it together. So thank you very much. I know, of course, that tonight's forum is focused on development, but I would like to provide you with a very, very brief overview of what the planning department does, because so many of you have a specific focus and aren't aware of the overall responsibilities of the department. We, of course, do work within an organizational structure. We report directly to the town administrator, who in turn reports to the select board. So we, in fact, work for the town administrator. The department consists of 3 divisions: the regulatory division under Polly Selko. Oh, well, it's there. Okay. Under Polly Selko, regulatory administers chapters 40A, B, and C of the Mass General Laws. We have the community planning division under Joe Viola. They apply for and administer about $1.6 million in federal community development block grant and home funds. They also support the maintenance and expansion of housing opportunities, specifically for affordable housing, and they undertake special projects. Perhaps the most notable one is, for the past 10 years, they've been involved in coordinating Gateway East, which is actually under construction, finally. And then we have Economic Development Long-Term Planning under the leadership of Kara Bruton. The division focuses on strengthening and expanding the tax base. This is done through supporting existing businesses and working to attract appropriate new commercial development. They also undertake a number of long-term planning projects. I do want to take this opportunity, I think most of you have some experience with the staff, but I want to take this opportunity to tell you how fortunate the town of Brookline is to have such an extraordinary staff, and I mean that. The planners have distinct expertise, education, and background in different functional elements of planning, and they bring a commitment and hard work to the job. But I think perhaps what I'm most proud of is the fact that there's not only a willingness but a desire to work together. The planning department is a team, and I know in the past it's been perceived as separate silos, but we do work as a team, both in addressing planning issues, working within the department, but also working within the entire town and working with the team that the town administrator has assembled. So we have planners representing a wide range of disciplines. This team approach, as I said, goes beyond just the planning department. It includes the entire town, all departments. The boards that are represented here tonight, as well as the other boards to which we provide staff support, are part of that team. And we have extraordinary amount of respect and admiration for not only the work you do, your commitment, but the valuable resources you provide to us as a department and to us as a town. But I do want to clarify that we work for the town administrator. We do not work for individual committees, boards, or commissions. But that being said, we really believe that we work with you. And most of you, well, while there are some departments that actually have statutory regulatory authority, most of the committees we provide staff support to, and at last count there were about 18, they provide advice to the select board. And that's the underlying goal of the planning department. We provide advice to the select board as the policy-making board of this town. And together, we are committed to providing information, technical advice, analysis, research, and at least a perception of what different interest groups within the public perceive as the important issues. And based on that information that we provide to the select board, or strive to provide, we anticipate that the select board will be in a position to make sound decisions. So therefore, we certainly look forward to working with everyone as a team as we approach development and other planning initiatives that are confronting the town. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Polly Selko, Assistant Director for Regulatory Planning.
Good evening. Polly Selko, Assistant Director of Regulatory Planning. As I'm sure most of you know, one of the most complicated things that the Planning Department and other town members do is to draft zoning bylaws. And we're often asked to draft zoning bylaws or to edit bylaws that have been drafted by other people. It's a difficult task because you have to make sure that the new bylaw doesn't conflict with any of the other sections of the zoning bylaw. We have to make sure that they're unambiguous and that different people reading them can interpret them the same way. And we also have to make sure that they don't conflict with either state or federal regulations. For instance, this town meeting, you may be seeing a warrant article on short-term rentals. The Planning and Community Development Department, with many other departments, worked for over a year on drafting this bylaw, and up until a few days ago, we were still making changes to it. We work with town council, we work with the building department, the health department, the fire department, and all three planning divisions had input into it, as well as soliciting public input to it. So this is an extremely important undertaking that we do. One of the other zoning amendments that we may look into will have something to do with parking, because as you may know, there have been a lot of zoning bylaw amendments submitted about parking. And 15, 20 years ago, all of the amendments actually increased parking requirements. They wanted to make sure there was enough parking for everybody, and to make sure that because there were several developments, older buildings that were built without parking, that there was enough parking for everybody. Now, the trend is to submit zoning warrant articles that actually reduce the parking requirements. So one of the things I think the planning department would like to do is to actually work with a consultant and to also work with the Department of Traffic and Engineering to work on what would be the appropriate parking regulations for different uses and for different areas of the town. Because it's one thing to kind of willy-nilly just submit these zoning warrant articles, and another to really take a long-range view of it and a comprehensive view of it. So in addition to doing all this research, The department tries to address the goals in the different planning policies of the town, and also for the strategic planning initiatives, we also have to do a lot of research, and Kara is going to speak to you about that.
So my name's Kara Bruton. I'm the Economic Development Director for the town. So what Polly was talking about was all of the research that happens and ends up in the end often being drafted as an effective bylaw, which is this slide that you see here tonight. And I should also add that all of these slides are going to be on the Planning Department webpage tomorrow morning, so we don't have to go through every line here. But before we write bylaws and guidelines and zoning, those are all the things that you see on the right of this image. We have foundational documents that we and other departments depend on. So of course there's a comprehensive plan up on the top left, but the recommendations in there are very general, and there's kind of a chicken in every pot. So these other studies that are more recent, are more data driven and have specific goals, we find to be useful in effectively updating the comp plan with more specific strategies that we want to take on. And we'll point out that the urban forestry plan on the bottom right is an example of one that the Parks and Open Space Division is taking on, and you'll be hearing more of that in the upcoming months. The Tree Protection Committee will be working with them to make that happen, but already there is cross collaboration with the Planning Department as well as GIS and Tom, who else? Yes? And Public Health, yeah. So a lot of these foundational documents, as they're being formed, cross different departments, not just the different divisions of the Planning Department. So in addition to kind of those larger policy studies, we also do smaller studies. They can be either led by staff, by third-party consultants for specific issues, or even the work solely done by committees and commissions. An example is the Climate Action Committee that took on the net zero school policy with staff support. And then there's project-based committees, and you'll hear a lot about different study committees tonight. So a couple of examples, you already heard from Polly about the parking demand analysis, I should say parking and access demand analysis, as Polly was saying. It's not just about the cars, it's about the use of the curbside, and that rate of change of going from cars to other modes of transportation is likely going to be a different rate of change in different parts of town. And if we could, we would like to do that for different parts of town rather than just picking numbers and seeing what flies at town meeting. Lower Boylston Street Study Corridor, Raul is leading that group, and we will be getting going in the next couple months. And the inclusionary zoning study, many of you probably know that the Housing Advisory Board, along with staff, are finishing up analysis and figuring out the exact right language before submitting that. So those are just a couple of examples. Before we can get all of this work done, we need to implement it, right? We need to actually make change happen. And to do that, we often need to go to town meeting to enact these recommendations. Virginia's going to give you a snapshot of development-related town meeting priorities, and this is just for our department.
Hi, I'm Virginia Bullock. I'm the senior housing planner for the town, and this slide sort of represents examples of some of the current initiatives that we are working on collectively with boards and commissions as a planning department. And I think it's helpful to note that we try to talk about the various divisions that are working on these various initiatives by color coding them. And it's important to note that often we work very collaboratively on projects and policies that are related to development that require town meeting approval, and we work across divisions, particularly on important work that's coordinated when making changes to the town's zoning bylaw. This requires significant collaboration to reflect both professional, technical aspects of the initiatives, but to integrate perspectives of the various boards and committees that we work with on the specific issue at hand. And this chart represents several of the current ones that we're looking at. We often in our department feel that we get deluged by warrant articles that are submitted by citizens, and we're attempting to try to make a little bit more of a smooth transition, because we do require the assistance of each other to get these things moving forward. So, for instance, inclusionary zoning bylaw, it's something that the Housing Advisory Board has been talking about for a while. We've done research. We are actually looking at that right now, and we'll be working on drafting and doing the bylaw and submitting it to town meeting this fall after an analysis by an outside consultant. And so that's work that's done in collaboration between the Community Planning Division as well as the Regulatory Division within our departments, in conjunction with the various boards that we staff. In addition to the work that we do at town meeting, we also, a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight has more to do with process, but I just want to make note that we do also, as a department, engage very intensively in project development, particularly when it comes to economic development and affordable housing. We're deeply involved in providing technical support to undertake large development projects related specifically to those, primarily to those two issue areas. For economic development, we're often involved in assisting the select board appointed subcommittees to evaluate infrastructure studies and mitigation, massing options, and various uses for the redevelopment of major parcels, while managing neighborhood input and defining community benefits. And that's all done before we go through the town meeting process. For affordable housing, we may engage in some of these activities for the larger redevelopment projects, such as a recent Olmsted Hill project that was done in the last 10 years or so, or the current redevelopment of the Kent Station Street parking lot. But on the affordable housing projects, we also work very closely to structure town funds to support these projects through the locally controlled resources that we have, like our housing trust and home and CDBG, and by ensuring that those funds are properly expended through the construction process, and that those units end up on the subsidized housing inventory, and that they're monitored annually. So we didn't want to leave the development side, or there's a lot of information about specific development projects on our town's website, and I believe that the chairs will also be talking specifically about some of those specific projects.
Well, this is about project reviews, and one of the most important functions of the planning staff is to provide enough information and background to the various boards that we staff so that they can make sound either recommendations or decisions on cases. We also try hard to level the playing field between developers and the neighbors and abutters by educating both sides on what the relevant issues are in terms of the technical and legal issues of a particular case, such as the pertinent case law, the state statutes, and the local regulations, as shown on the right side of this slide. I would like to give an example of a large project review that includes input from all three divisions of the Planning and Community Development Department, and that's the Waldo-Durgan proposal. The Economic Development Advisory Board, its subcommittees, along with public input, played a large role in formulating acceptable parameters and design guidelines for development on this site in Coolidge Corner. And finally, proposing a zoning amendment, which was subsequently approved by town meeting. Now the developer needs to go through the Planning Board and Board of Appeals review and approval process, and those steps are numerous. They have to submit a preliminary proposal. They have to, the planning board will appoint a design advisory team to work with the developer and his or her architect. There'll be several meetings looking at the design issues. They'll also have to meet with the affordable housing officer to clarify what affordable housing that they will be providing, either on-site or as a cash payment. And then, of course, the planning board has a formal hearing on it or formal meeting on it and makes recommendations for different conditions. Lastly, the Board of Appeals will hear the case and will either approve or deny the case. If they approve it, I can't think of any case they've approved without having multiple conditions. And those conditions have to be met before, for the most part, before a building permit is issued. Then, after they get that building permit, before they can get a certificate of occupancy, all the departments, building, planning, transportation, preservation, if applicable, have to sign off on the project before they can get their certificate of occupancy. So I'd like to introduce now Tina McCarthy, who serves on the Preservation Commission staff, and she will tell you a little bit about their processes.
My name's Tina McCarthy. I'm one of the preservation planners here in Brookline. Preservation planners administer Brookline's 8 local historic districts under Mass 40C and the demolition delay bylaw, which is Article 5.3. Unlike the rest of regulatory planning, we do not deal with zoning. We have our own regulations, which are not zoning. And applications come to our department in 3 different ways. You can see that in my graphic there. We have the building department, the planning department, and then applications that come directly into preservation. And although all these processes are separate, they very much happen at the same time, and all the staff has to coordinate across departments in order to facilitate that process. So overall, we estimate that at least 60% of the cases that our office sees are handled on the staff level. These approvals include the local historic district non-app, 10-day letters, demolition findings of non-significance. We also provide advisory services to applicants in planning stages of projects and information to the public at large about historic resources in Brookline. So you can see the graph on the lower right of demolition delay cases. This graph spans from 2005 to 2019. And as you can see, our caseload is increasing, while at the same time, the number of full demolitions is actually decreasing. And we attribute that to effective planning, naturally. But Brookline has passed some revisions to its demolition delay bylaw. In 2018 was the last time that major revisions were made. And so over time, that bylaw has gotten more effective. Oh, sorry. So as preservation staff, we have increased in number over the years, and because of those increases, we can also take on extra projects. So this goes beyond the scope of what we deal with sometimes on the regulatory level with the Preservation Commission at public hearings. So we're doing research and development, survey planning grants that is coordinated with the Mass Historical Commission. We do research and establish the historic significance of Brookline neighborhoods, so when people come for their demolition permit, we already have the research done and we can proceed efficiently with that regulation. So, thank you.
Hello, I'm Maria Morelli. I'm a senior planner in the regulatory division, and in the 6 years that I've worked for the town, I've probably have worked on 2 to 3 Chapter 40B projects a year. So Brookline, you have really kept me busy. Before I get into project review for Chapter 40Bs, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the big picture. So in the past 3 years, that's a very compressed period of time, the ZBA has permitted about 11 projects. That amounts to about 729 units. Almost 200 are affordable units for families. All of these are rental projects, and some are mixed use. The ZBA does go above and beyond what the state mandates by conditioning these affordable units to be conditioned permanently deed restricted. And what might not be known, if you look at this in the aggregate, the town has secured, thanks to the ZBA, over $1 million in mitigation funds from these projects. A lot of these go to improvements in the public way, from multimodal transport like pedestrian improvements, bike share, roadway improvements, and street tree planting. For 2020, we're looking at 3 more ZBA proposals, which would bring online, if they're approved, 243 units, about a quarter would be affordable. And this is just a really brief distribution of what we see from the north to south borders of Brookline. You can see, if you're traveling in Coolidge Corner, we have 3 on Harvard that are under construction, 1 on Babcock that you'll see under construction, and there is construction that's beginning at Hancock Village. Then they range in size from 8 unit to 226 units. So up until now, you've been hearing about development reviews that really act upon those 5 foundational planning documents that Kara spoke about. Now you come to 40B, which provides much needed low and moderate income housing, but to do so, it actually overrides local regulations. And not only overrides local regulations, but the ZBA acts in the place of all local boards. So all of this expertise that we have, any boards that have authority or jurisdiction, now that is being passed on to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So you're also dealing with some of the most complex projects that this board will review, and the state mandates that these reviews, the cap is 6 months. So you have complex projects. The foundational documents that are used to navigate these projects are actually could be put aside. And you have the ZBA, which really isn't conducting the design review in the normal course of its business. So you might think at this point the score must be the developer all and the town nothing. In reality, we are looking at projects that are approved with conditions. And each of the 11 projects that have been permitted in the last 3 years were permitted with between 80 and 100 conditions each. And that's a testament to the meticulous nature of how the ZBA is conducting this review. It's also a testament to the developers that instead of walking away from the table, they do stick it out. They are responsive. It is an expensive endeavor. They've paid for all the peer review that we've required. And they've also given us extensions. So that max cap of 6 months often gets extended to 8 months or a year. And here's an example of some of the movement we can see at the negotiating table between the ZBA and the developer. This is 136 Babcock, which is at the intersection of Freeman and Babcock. And over the course of a year's time, these are some of the results that were achieved. So the project was actually brought down most dramatically through the architectural changes. So the first picture is what initially came in and how it got reshaped. And that resulted in a reduction of 20,000 square feet of square footage being eliminated, and that amounted to about 15 units. The setbacks for the front and the rear actually were more in line with the modal development patterns in that neighborhood. The height at the rear, where it penetrates a 2-family district, is actually reduced to 3 stories, and through our visual studies, is actually out of the sight lines of the second floor of those homes that could view the projects. The stormwater management was actually improved over existing conditions. Safer vehicle access and egress was achieved. Tree planting, extensive tree planting on the site was used to restore any tree loss, and there are plans to protect the numerous trees in the abutting neighborhood, as well as thousands of dollars contributed to the street tree fund. So what do we do if we are going to override local regulations? What is the structure that the ZBA does use, especially if a developer, conceivably does have all the marbles? What leverage does the Board of Appeals have? And what staff provides is a framework called Site Plan and Design Review. And our job is to make sure that the board has as its disposal all of the evidence and data it needs to assess, number one, the first tier, are public health and environmental safety concerns. The other tier really has to do with assessing increased density. Remember, you have that playbook, our zoning dimensional requirements to push to the side, and now the ZBA has this task of trying to figure out how much increased density can be sustained on the site. So what we use are intensity of use factors. So dwelling units per acre and another metric like floor area ratio really don't give us the information that we need. We actually have to delve in a little bit more into understanding how that site plan needs to function, what uses are going to be supporting the program. There's a big difference between a destination restaurant and a knitting shop, for instance, and as well as those good neighbor standards that we have in our regulations concerning noise, lighting, buffers, etc. We do that through a rigorous process that involves independent peer review, traffic, parking, stormwater, in some cases geotechnical and blasting if required, and always architecture. We rely on the technical reviews that involve at least 10 town departments and divisions. Even though the boards and commissions don't have jurisdictions in most cases, they may supply comments, and many of them actually hold hearings. And that testimony is submitted to the ZBA, and that expertise is relied upon by the ZBA. We have at our disposal legal counsel through the Mass Housing Partnership Technical Assistance Grant. And I just want to point out that independent peer review, we control the scopes of the work. They report to the ZBA, but those invoices go to the developer, and that's tens of thousands of dollars that the developer assumes. And last but not least, public comment is critical and necessary. It might feel that people don't have any choices or any latitude in shaping these projects. It is very much a public hearing process. The ZBA takes and considers public comment, and very much that framework that we have for site plan and a design review is for the public. It provides assurances to the public that the concerns they're raising have a place when we analyze those different functional areas. So we can't really talk about 40B without wondering about the subsidized housing inventory. And so with that, I will turn it over to Director Steinfeld.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to provide some information on the SHI, or subsidized housing inventory, but I want to grab a few extra minutes at the end. As of February 21st, about 10 days ago, the building commissioner issued a partial building permit to Chestnut Hill Realty to construct the residence of South Brookline. At that point, the town of Brookline, pending state certification, is at 10%. Thank you, and I want to, on behalf of the staff that has done an extraordinary job, and the ZBA, but we're definitely not done yet. First of all, that 10% is going to fluctuate for any number of reasons. One is unless a building permit is issued within 1 year of the comprehensive permit, those units fall off of the SHI. I expect our denominator in terms of the total housing stock to go up probably minimally when the federal housing census comes out, but no unit is permanently on the SHI until the occupancy permit is issued. Now, I fully expect state certification, but we are close. It's only by 6 units, but who's counting? And again, I want to thank staff and the ZBA. I will tell you, the town is always still subject to 40B. Once a project eligibility letter is issued, an applicant may still apply to the town for a comprehensive permit. We are legally required to open the hearing within 30 days. The big difference is that the ZBA then has a choice. They can deny given that we've hit 10%. They can proceed through the public hearing process, as we have done with the 16 prior 40Bs, or they can notify the applicant that we are at 10%, he is proceeding at risk, but we want to entertain the proposal. And quite honestly, pending anything dramatic, my inclination will be to recommend to the ZBA, and ultimately it's the ZBA's decision, that the ZBA continue the hearing and try to work it out as an opportunity to not only expand the housing supply for market rate units, but certainly for affordable. But let's wait to hear from the state. Now for my extra 2 minutes. I just want to expand on some of the comments that were made regarding warrant articles. The planning department, unless directed otherwise by the town administrator, is taking a new approach to warrant articles. Obviously, 10 citizens can and should petition and place a warrant article on the warrant. But if that involves zoning or perhaps anything else relating to planning, we are not necessarily going to review those proposals or make a recommendation to the select board other than they warrant additional work. And that means technical analysis and an opportunity for the public to fully vet that warrant article. We too often in this town, from my perspective at least, have engaged in reactive planning, and I think that's an oxymoron. Planning and zoning specifically requires a great deal of work, and there are a host of different interest groups, a host of implications that have to be evaluated. And our zoning bylaw, I mean, select person Franco went through how complicated our process is. Well, no, our process is complicated, but our zoning bylaw is very complicated. I know the building commissioner in the back has a tough job enforcing our zoning bylaw. And part of that is because it's been creative with layer after layer of warrant articles and the need to respond to an issue fast and without analysis. And therefore, I'm hoping for everyone's support that under the direction of the town administrator and the select board, we will identify warrant articles that deserve further work and give us the time to adequately and fully vet them, both from a technical perspective and from allowing the public to engage in the process. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you, back to you.
Thank you very much. That was very enlightening and helpful. I think we're going to start passing out cards. I don't have any right now, so I will. I'll use my prerogative to ask the first question.
Yeah, there were cards in the front lobby. Does
Okay.
if anybody, unless someone has a burning question, I see a burning question in the back. And you, is that Linda?
Well, while we collect that card, let me take it off and ask the first question here. I'm wondering. I think it was Polly who cited the Waldo Durgan project as sort of something that brought together the different divisions of planning. I have a sort of an operational question using Waldo Durgan as the example. How does the planning department coordinate between the different divisions to perhaps flag that something's coming down the road, that we're working on this now, but it's going to land on your laps in 3 weeks or 3 months? Are there regular meetings, staff meetings?
I was just going to say that we do have regular staff meetings where we discuss exactly what each division is doing, what's in the pipeline, what we'll be working on in the future. And then, of course, as the projects come up, we'll have special meetings of the people in the department that will be involved. And then again, we also meet with a lot of the other different departments in town. So that's how we handle it.
If I could add, I have weekly meetings with my division heads. We also have weekly regulatory meetings that the building commissioner and I instituted about 6 years ago that involves the building commissioner, the deputy building commissioner, and all the regulatory staff. So we're on top of the projects.
Question from the audience, I think to Ms. Steinfeld. If the town is at 10%, what happens to the comprehensive permit applications that are still in the queue? Does the ZBA have leeway to approve or deny those?
No, once the operative SHI affecting any development proposal is the date that proposal applies to the town for a comprehensive permit. So all projects pending before the ZBA will have the protection of 40B. Any future applications, assuming we're at certified 10% and we stay at 10%, cannot avail themselves of the 40B protections at the 10%.
We've got a question about how do we make the Planning and Community Development Department even more proactive and strategic? And perhaps somebody can answer with a lens towards what are we doing to clean up the zoning bylaw that is so confusing and difficult to enforce?
Well, I'll start with the latter question. It's maybe 2 years ago, the planning department, in conjunction with the building department, were given $200,000 in the CIP to engage a consultant to recodify the zoning bylaw. What we did initially is we hired General Code to basically focus on editorial improvements to the bylaw. That involves reorganizing and then identifying inconsistencies, both internal inconsistencies and inconsistencies with state case law. And then separately identifying policy issues that they were not engaged to address that would involve a significant amount of analysis and public input and involving the boards. That was submitted to us in November of 2019. And I can tell you because, in large measure, because of last year's town meeting, neither the building department, nor certainly the planning department, have been able to look at that. We certainly hope to, that and inclusionary zoning are my priorities. I got a nod from Roger Blood, for our next level of priorities, because we have to look at that and go from there. And I anticipate going to town meeting in the fall with a zoning bylaw that is clean, that sets up separately a number of policy issues, and that perhaps best of all is interactive. It's really exciting. I got through the first 76 pages a few months ago, but it will be interactive, and then we'll go from there because we have about $194,000 left. So I probably shouldn't have said that.
So many of the people in this room play a direct role in shaping new guidance or regulations or vetting proposals. What opportunities are there for the public to engage in these conversations? How can we, where can we channel folks to feel like they've got an influence, a meaningful influence on the rules we're writing and the direction we're headed?
Well, in terms of the boards, committees, and commissions, obviously all of their meetings are held in public, so there's certainly an opportunity for that. We are exploring ways of, right now, we are statutorily required to notify property owners of a pending public hearing, and there are some possible warrant articles that have raised the issue of notifying people, including tenants, in other ways, and we're exploring some methods to do that as well. We have a solid website, and if I can take this opportunity, we have some vacancies among some of our departments, so anyone interested, I'm sure the select board would be happy to hear from you.
Thank you for the answers to those questions. Why don't we move on to the next section of the meeting. So the next section of tonight's session, the forum, is to hear from board and commission chairs about three topics. We'll focus on three topics: the membership of their groups, recent accomplishments, and a little bit about their priorities and the initiatives that they're working on. And we're going to go in the following order. So we're going to hear first from Steve Hyken on behalf of the Planning Board. Then we're going to hear from Roger Blood on behalf of the HAB. Paul Sainer, I think, is going to be in the hole, so to speak, to talk on behalf of economic development. And then Elton Elprin and David King are going to talk on behalf of the Preservation Commission, I think. And then we'll close out with Werner Lowe talking on behalf of the CAC. And then, again, following those presentations, I'll be back and we'll do another question and answer session. So to you, Steve.
So thank you, Ben. Hi, good evening. I'm Steve Hyken. I'm the chair of the Planning Board. And so who we are, and I think 4 or 5 of us are here. The Planning Board is supposed to have 7 members. We are down to 6 right now, so we will be looking for volunteers. Of the current 6 of us, 4 of us are architects, 2 landscape architects, and 2 of us, myself and Mark Zerillo, 1 architect and 1 landscape architect, are also planners and, you know, practice planning and urban design as well as landscape and architecture in our careers. We recently lost the 7th member, was Bob Cook, who was neither an architect nor a planner. He was the longtime executive director of the Arnold Arboretum, so he brought a very expansive kind of ecological, environmental perspective to the Planning Board. And if we were looking for another discipline, and we were appointed by the Select Board, we would love to have somebody either like Bob or, say, an attorney, a real estate attorney. We've had those in the past to bring that perspective to the Planning Board. But we're doing fine with 6, but we'd like to have that 7th member. And so those of you who are interested or know someone, as Allison said, put the word out. So what do we do? Our key role is that we're advisory to the Zoning Board of Appeals. We're the first step after all that alphabet soup that Ben gave such a detailed explanation of. Once a project is actually submitted for development to the building department, if it requires any zoning relief, either a special permit, which is a moderate level of relief, it might have to do with front or side yard setbacks or rear yard setback or floor area ratio, or major relief, which is a variance, which is a much higher standard, and we didn't set these rules, but anything relative to height requires a variance, whereas side yards and rear yards are special permits. Anyway, if a project needs zoning relief, it's rejected with an explanation of what relief is needed, and it comes to the Planning Board for review. And our review, while it looks at negotiating how much relief a project really needs, how much it deserves, it also engages very much in design review. Any project that is considered a major project, and those are defined in the zoning bylaw as anything or on or within 100 feet of Beacon Street, Com Ave, Boylston Street, Harvard Street, Brookline Ave, or Washington Street, all of our major arteries, any project on or near those streets is automatically a major project. Also, any project that is 4 or more dwelling units can be considered a major project. 3 or more townhouses is a major project. So a lot of the projects that come before us are considered major projects. If that decision is made, then the Planning Board can appoint, we don't always, but we can appoint a design advisory team, which is another opportunity for public participation. Those teams usually include several members of the Planning Board, several other local professionals, architects or planners, and also several neighborhood representatives. They're usually 5 to 7 people, and we've had them on many projects, and I'm going to talk about a number of projects that went through the design advisory team, design review process, and came out, we think, better for process. And I think the developers that we've engaged with would almost uniformly agree. We also, and we do those meetings on Thursday evenings. We meet at the same time as the zoning board, so we don't interact a lot with the zoning board. We're both meeting at the same time. One way, a nice way to think about how we relate to the zoning board, we sort of negotiate design, we talk about design. We, in a design advisory team, those meetings, and we invite the public to those meetings as well. We invite comment for anybody, whether they're on a design advisory team or not, and we don't vote on projects. There might be half a dozen people on a design advisory team who will give a developer half a dozen different ideas on how they ought to modify a project, and it's up to the developer and his or her architect to come back and make sense out of all that and see what they can do. Randy Michaeljohn earlier tonight said, comparing what the zoning board's role is to our role is, we do this discussion and they call the balls and strikes when it gets to them. Most of the time when we review a project, if we approve it, it's advisory to the zoning board, and most of the time they will probably feel the same way. They mostly approve projects that we recommend, and if we recommend denial of a project, they usually feel the same way. There have been recent cases, and I'm grateful to them. There was a project on Washington Street where the family that owned this house wanted to tear it down and build a very contemporary building that they came back to us, I would say 4 times, as we kept asking for modifications to a design which the neighbors were very unhappy with. It didn't require any zoning relief in the end, but we finally sort of said, okay, and I would say that the planning board does not specifically make determinations of what's appropriate design. We're not unwilling to consider contemporary design, and you may see new buildings around town that are contemporary. There's one on Greeno Street that I've heard a lot about. Some of those projects don't even come to the planning board because they conform to zoning. So they submit their permit for building and they get it, and we don't even see it. But in this case on Washington Street, after months of meeting, 4 or 5 meetings, we finally said, okay, we feel like you've modified this enough that we're willing to go along with it. We sent it to the zoning board, and I'm grateful that they actually turned it down. So sometimes the process takes a couple of steps before a resolution is reached, and sometimes it works the other way. We turn something down and they accept it, but usually we're on the same page. We have a minor role in reviewing sign and facade applications. Every sign that appears on a new business in town has to come to the planning board. Lately, as you heard from the preservation planner, if they're fairly straightforward, they can be approved administratively. But there are still signs that come to us. We talk about color, we talk about size, we talk about lighting, and we usually think that they are improved by our interaction there as well. Going on, the bigger picture, we are usually involved in the major town planning initiatives. Members of the planning board typically sit on the working committees that have been involved in the housing production plan, the major parcel study, the strategic asset plan, and we hope to see the recommendations of those plans implemented as we move forward. We also, on occasion, look at specific areas of town and look at design guidelines. We're currently, and I'll mention this again later, we're looking at Beacon Street. There were some design guidelines for Beacon Street that go back 20 or 30 years. They're very vague, don't really do much of anything, and so we're taking a much more specific look at Beacon Street, both in terms of the open space and the built forms that line that street. And finally, when it does come to warrant articles that involve zoning that come to town meeting, the planning board reviews, helps tweak them, and makes recommendations to town meeting on those articles. So that's what we do. We meet at least 2 Thursday evenings a month, a couple of Wednesday mornings, and often another time or 2 each month. So we're fairly busy. I wanted to use the rest of my time to talk about 5 projects that I think, where I think the planning board had a significant role in improving what was initially submitted to us. And some of these projects exhibit issues that were raised earlier by Ben, and the first couple of them are hotels. We like hotels in Brookline. You've probably all seen the development at Cleveland Circle. That took about 4 years of back and forth planning, several different developers. I think maybe 3 different architectural teams were involved. When the and that project also is both in Brookline and in Boston, so it took review of both this town and what was then the BRA, and we sat in on meetings in Boston. This is the original site. Actually, if you remember, the theater building was here and the Applebee's was there. The only part of the site that's actually in Brookline was the parking lot in front of the theater. That's the town line. I think the town line probably goes this way. This is Clinton Road here. That's Brookline. But most of this project was and is in Boston. What Brookline really wanted was to see if there was going to be a hotel there. The portion of the project that was a hotel, we wanted it in Brookline. And so the zoning for this site was kind of recrafted, and an agreement was created that sort of achieved that. The original proposal was a sort of a tuning fork-shaped building that enclosed a very tight courtyard But the piece in Brookline over here, this is Chestnut Hill Avenue, was going to be medical offices over retail, like the worst of all worlds. Lots of cars and parking coming and going, patients visiting every 20 minutes, and the hotel was elsewhere. So that didn't meet with a lot of enthusiasm here. And over the course of years, the project evolved. There was versions where the entry was in the middle, still with a building, a very complicated building where the hotel and the residential were stacked on top of one another. I mean, I'm not a finance guy, but strictly from a finance point of view, that struck me from the beginning as something that would be very problematic. They were sharing facilities, et cetera. And this was a view of that, a very claustrophobic courtyard. There was another option to have the access right along the T tracks. That wasn't very popular either. What we finally got as a result were two separate buildings. I know it's a little hard to read this diagram, but the senior independent living on one side and the hotel on the other side. All of the hotel, all of Brookline is hotel. And this is actually a rendering, but that's sort of what that looks like, with an open roadway through the middle. And you may have also noticed that the original proposal had a much longer building extending along the T tracks that was, greatly abridged, and I think a fairly successful mixed-use development. Another hotel development, which Ben mentioned, he was the chair of the River Road Study Committee, which I was a member of, along with a couple of other planning board members. The River Road site was one of the only industrial areas in Brookline. Brookline Ice and Coal is at one end of it, the former Gulf Station at the other end. A very narrow strip of land. Here's the hotel site. But the developer that did the previous Route 9 hotel wanted to also develop this site. However, you cannot build a hotel on an industrial zone site. So but we like hotels. They give us not only real estate tax, but the room occupancy tax is sort of a double positive whammy. They bring other business to town. But because the developer needed a zoning change, the town was able to negotiate a kind of a development that sort of met community needs, provided some revenue, and also enhanced sort of an underutilized site. One of the things that we did, and I'm not sure how relevant this still is, but through a lot of careful design thinking, the parcels adjacent and north of the hotel are very narrow and would be very difficult to create any kind of structured parking on those sites because of the narrow depth of those sites. We got the hotel developer to agree to build their hotel and their parking in such a way that this is the hotel garage on the second floor, could provide access to the adjacent building with an easement to do that if and when another building ever is erected. Since we did this, some of you may have noticed even around Brookline, there's been sort of the advent of mechanical parking systems with elevators and turntables. So I'm not sure this is necessary anymore, but it was at the time, I think, a very hard-won concession from the developers of this site to allow their property to be used to access the adjacent properties. We also worked very hard to see to it that the ground floor was activated with restaurants and cafes, including a cafe that opens out to River Road across from the Riverway green space. And as you can see, that building is now fairly well along construction. It went from a very kind of simple wire diagram to a very sophisticated fritted glass building that is very sleek, and I think will be a very welcoming gateway to Brookline on a formerly underutilized site. At a much smaller scale, the former Dunkin' Donuts site at Route 9 and High Street, you wouldn't have thought so, but that site is actually large enough to accommodate a building. This is a condominium with ground floor retail of, I think, about 14 units. And this project actually did not need very much, if any, zoning relief. They were able to build something on that site within the zoning envelope that was allowed, but because it was a major impact project, we had design review. And I think our major goal here, our outcome, was to get them to rethink their design, because their original design included access to parking from Route 9. This is Walnut Street, High Street, and Route 9 here. La Mora is up here. Access from Route 9 to some surface parking and down to a garage, and access to a retail space that's on the corner. The residential access was from Walnut Street, so you could come in here and park, but to get to your unit, yeah, there was an elevator in the garage, but visitors, et cetera, no way to get there. what we got the developer to see was there was a way to modify the structure of this building to allow people who, this is now Boylston Street is up here, to park, come in on the Boylston Street side, park here, and actually get into the residential building from the parking area. There were a lot of other little changes in the building, but basically our major contribution here in a design advisory team was to help the developer and his architect make this building actually function for its site in a way that it didn't when they first brought it to us. Here's a rendering of what that building, which is now under construction, will look like. There's a lot of discussion of the elevations and you know, it's across the street from the fire station and the former Brookline Bank and how it fit in with that historic context without being a replica historic building. Moving on to South Brookline, Hancock Village, we just heard that their 40B project is about to get under construction. This is another part of the overall development, the Jerry building. This is actually not a 40B. This is a market rate building of, I think, 36 units or so, of which there will be, their inclusionary zoning, 15% of the units will be affordable. When this project was first presented to us, this is in the place of one of their garages and maintenance buildings. It was a 200-foot long or so building with lots of gables and a couple of roofs and just a very repetitive, boring, symmetrical building that also had about a 60-foot long ramp to get to the front door, which is up a half a level. I don't know how well you can see it here. And all the parking, the front of the building was going to be totally dedicated to head-in parking and more parking in the back on the surface. The building was slab on grade. First, we got them to get rid of the parking in front of the building and said, look, you've got this big building, it's a double-loaded building, it can fit perfectly over a garage. Why don't you have a garage? It's a marked rate building. Why isn't there a garage under that building? So after a little bit of pushing, they agreed to put a garage underneath the building, get rid of the parking in the front so there could be a bigger green space. But we still had this 60-foot long ramp to get to the front door and some steps there. And we said, not good enough. And again, this building didn't really need much design relief, zoning relief, but it needed design enhancement. And we eventually got them to not so much lower the building to grade, because there's still parking under it. The building is still half a level above grade. But by just a simple redesign of how the elevator worked, we were able to get them to provide a grade level accessible entrance with an elevator that went up a half a floor, go in at the street level, get off at the first level, go down to the garage. And a little bit more, a non-symmetrical building with a more thoughtful use of materials and roof lines, and I think a successful outcome there that even Justin Hill Realty would agree was worth the trouble of the design advisory team. One last project, fairly small project, but also I think a significant enhancement. This is a lot on Auburn Street between Harvard Street and Park. It had been a parking lot, neighborhood parking area for many years. When the owner of that lot first came to us, he was proposing a 5-story building which had, I believe, 5 levels of parking underground. More building underground than you actually see on the surface. In a building that also came within 5 feet of the property line on all 4 sides. And so it needed a lot of zoning relief. And we basically said, you have an empty lot here. What entitles you to expect that kind of relief for this project? What's your hardship here? And so after many iterations of design, I don't know if you can see this, this building started off with 29 units in 2015. It came down to 23 units in 2016, to 15 units later in 16, still 15 in 2017. Finally, we ended up with 12 units. The project that started at 29 units, it met all of the zoning setbacks, front, side, and rear, and the parking was reduced to 2 levels below grade and went from 53 spaces to 26. Actually, one of their requirements was they had to replace all the parking on that original neighborhood lot, plus serve the new residents of their building. So again, a successful outcome with much better setbacks, and it's really symptomatic of a planning board kind of stance these days, which is if you're building a project on an empty lot, or you're building something new, whether your lot's empty or you're tearing something down, we're not about to just give you zoning relief. You should meet the zoning bylaw. unless it's a 40B, of course, and then we have less control. So that's sort of an overview of some things we've been doing lately. That Auburn Street project's under construction. What are our current, more sort of programmatic initiatives? I don't know how many of you have heard about a state zoning decision generally known as the Diedrich decision, whereby a single or two-family home that is a pre-existing non-conforming home, let's say it exceeds the allowed floor area or floor area ratio or height, can be expanded, be made even larger or higher with only a special permit. I mean, ordinarily something like that would need a variance if it was allowed at all, but under this Diedrich decision, buildings that exceed their allowed area or height can be expanded with only a special permit, whereas the house next door, which might conform to zoning, can't be. So that makes no sense to us on the planning board, and we've recently developed some guidelines that basically say, okay, if we have to do this, we're not going to give you any more relief than we would give the conforming home next door, which kind of puts a limit on it. We expect some pushback from the attorneys who represent these homeowners, but we're willing to, I don't know if town council's willing to deal with it, but I think we should deal with that. We also are trying to enhance what we refer to as counterbalancing amenities. When projects are given zoning relief, they're often expected to provide a counterbalancing amenity. For residential projects, that's typically something like enhanced landscaping, but we're thinking more of larger commercial projects and what those projects can do to enhance the streetscape, the public space around a commercial development. And finally, as was mentioned earlier, we are looking at design guidelines currently for Beacon Street, along with the Preservation Commission. And I think one aspect of that is we will be looking at the zoning in the commercial neighborhoods of Beacon Street, St. Mary's, Coolidge Corner, and Washington Square to look for opportunities for enhanced incentives for development that might be mixed use, commercial and residential. So that's what we're up to.
Thank you. Roger, you're up.
Going backwards here? I want to go forward.
Yeah, I'll do it, Roger.
I still want to go forward. There we go. Thanks. Backward now. This is. We've gone through the whole show. I'm finished. So there's not going to be any surprises in this show. Well, first of all, thanks to Ken for inventing this session and so many interested folks for showing up, and Ben for give that microphone up. For teeing this up so well. I haven't seen so many cryptic acronyms since working for involuntarily for Uncle Sam. The only one I didn't quite understand was SOL, and so I put a card in your stack there, so you can explain that one to us.
It's a technical term.
You're in the military, you don't know that?
Well, it was a long time ago. That's probably the reason. There was a question. I'd like to start off just mentioning about a little bit about public engagement. There was a question earlier, mainly so I don't forget at the end. The operative housing planning document that Kara mentioned, I would encourage you, if I can interest you in housing more than you are already, at the end of this on the town's website, the housing production plan. You can click through and find that. That was probably the most major year-long effort of public engagement that the Housing Advisory Board had done to that date to produce that document. And that was planning through getting at the 10%, which you've heard about. So in housing, we are at this major juncture now in terms of not just the numbers, but thinking about housing and where the town wants to go from here. We'll maybe take a very short breath and pause, but not pause very long, and keep going with some energy and some direction. And in that regard, with regard to public engagement, the HAB is going to be co-sponsoring a significant outreach event shortly, co-sponsoring with the Committee for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. And Joan, you might want to, can you mention what the date and the time and the place are for that folks will be invited to?
It's going to be March 29th, it's a Sunday, from 1 to 3:30, and we're about to sign on the dotted line for the multi-purpose room at Rumble School. So please come to bring everybody you know.
And the purpose of that is to raise not only awareness of housing and affordable housing, but to grow support and expanded constituencies for what we'd like to do from here. So with that said, the basic way that our affordable housing effort is structured, at least from the volunteer side and from the bylaw side, I like to think of it as a three-legged stool, and it goes back over 30 years to when the town was phasing out of rent control and into more structured, affordable housing for people who actually had income levels that needed the housing the most. And the three parts of a bylaw at that time that were passed together and intended to work together were our inclusionary zoning bylaw, which requires a percentage of all multifamily housing to be designated as affordable, the establishment of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and then the creation of the Housing Advisory Board. And the HAB has three very closely intertwined responsibilities. We oversee the inclusionary zoning, both the concept and the overall approach, but also the individual interactions with developers when they come with proposals for multi-housing development. The HAB members, the 7 HAB members, are actually the trustees of the Affordable Housing Trust itself. So that involves the use of financial resources in support of affordable housing. And then more broadly, the HAB's role is to develop and advise on housing policy, policies and goals. In the chart, you saw it to the select board, but it can be really in general for the town at large and for town meeting and the advisory committee and what have you. Our basic mission is, the easy one is the creation of affordable housing, the expansion of the housing stock, but equally in our official mission is the preservation of affordable housing as well. And that's kind of a sleeper, but it's fairly labor intensive, especially with our wonderful housing division staff, because once an affordable unit is created, it requires permanent monitoring for continued compliance. So, can we go backwards again? The Housing Advisory Board it's interesting in the way it was structured from the original bylaw, and whoever did it was really prescient, I think, in the way we've seen it function under that structure for a long time. There are 7 members, and 4 are appointed by the Select Board, and 5 are appointed by the Select Board, but 1 is a special designee that has to be a renter of low or moderate income to represent that constituency on the HAB. There are 2 designated seats, permanent seats, that are required. We must always have a sitting member of the planning board, and we're currently fortunate to have the chair, Steve Hyken, in that role, and also a member of the Brookline Housing Authority Board of Directors, and Mike Jacobs, also the chair of that board, is the current and somewhat long-term sitting member on that. So if sending the chair people to the HAB is an indication of their level of interest and support, that's a good thing. The other thing that the original bylaw says, it's kind of a best efforts, but it said that the select board should try to assure in their appointments a very specific range of skills. And they're actually spelled out in the bylaw. And we've had that now, and we've had it for a number of years, and it's worked quite well. At the present time, we have Jonathan Klein filling the legal slot or skill set, if you will. He's a lifelong leader in affordable housing law. Many of you may know of him. Jenny Raitt for housing and housing planning, 10 years with MAPC as a housing planner. We currently, fortunately, a Brookline resident, but the actual planning director. She has Allison's job out in the town of Arlington. Bill Madsen-Hardy, sitting in the back, is a very accomplished affordable housing developer who has been active throughout Boston and actually was the developer of the Olmsted Hill affordable housing up at the top of Fisher Hill. And we're asked to have design expertise, which we have from Steve, and affordable housing program expertise, which Mike Jacobs certainly brings as he is a full-time consultant on affordable housing programs and financing. The inclusionary zoning bylaw, as I mentioned, requires a set aside of affordable housing for projects with 15 or more units, in which case the housing has to be set aside physically in the proposed development. For projects that are small to medium-sized, 6 to 15 units, the developers are able to make a cash payment on an established fee schedule into the Affordable Housing Trust. And on larger, unusual projects such as Waldo Durgan and currently everybody's hearing about Newbury, which has a big affordable housing component to it, there's a certain amount of latitude for the HAB on behalf of the town to negotiate a best outcome, best possible outcome for the town and for affordable housing. So under inclusionary zoning, the town has produced somewhat over 100 affordable housing units in more than 20 projects, and about half of those are in affordable condominiums or for sale units, 21 in rental units in 7 projects, 17 units in one assisted living project, and that's the Goddard House done some years ago, and 15 affordable, what's known as SROs, another acronym that I don't think made it into your list, single room occupancy, lodging houses, we've done in one project. As was mentioned, we are planning to have some strengthening of the inclusionary zoning bylaw this year. We've completed a consulting work with very specific recommendations and financial modeling from Pam McKinney, who's done a lot of real estate and financial work for the town. And coming out of that will be a number of things before the end of the year, but one of the things is there's a feeling with the current market that there's probably some significant money that's being left on the table for affordable housing, and so we're going to be developing a significantly higher fee schedule for that purpose. Over the years, since the Housing Trust Fund, it actually legally was formed about 30 years ago. It became active about 20 years ago. It's taken in $14 million, of which about half have come from private housing developers with their proposed projects, and that's and about $5.5 million have been annual contributions from the town. Most, but not all years, there's a formula that generates some of the so-called free cash to the Affordable Housing Trust, and interest on the fund. It's got some significant balance in it, which isn't always $1.5 million. The trust fund is very productive because we're able to leverage the resources, the dollars that are in that fund. if housing is put into a project, it's just the value of that unit, which is quite valuable. But as you can see over the years, it's not a huge number of units that are actually physically created in the projects themselves. What the trust fund is able to do with the financial proceeds from inclusionary zoning is to leverage, meaning largely with nonprofits, though not entirely, who such as Two Life communities. They come with a proposal such as the one you'll see in a moment at KI on Harvard Street in JFK Crossing, where they have completed a plan and they're all ready to go, and they are experts at getting state and federal subsidies to bring to their project. But Brookline is so expensive, the land especially, that they need just that little bit of additional funding from the trust fund, from the town, to make their projects work financially. So while the cost of actually creating an affordable unit in Brookline, what we call closing the affordability gap, is $350,000 to $450,000 between a market rate and the equivalent affordable unit. Using the trust fund, the average cost of producing affordable units in Brookline, the average cost has only been $50,000. We produced nearly 200 units with about $10 million. And again, that's by leveraging all these other subsidies that are brought into the town by mission-based developers. Seven projects of note that have been funded are in the course of being funded now. You'll see here, and I'm just going to run through these seven with some visuals for you to get a flavor, and you'll recognize any of them, if not most, and then give you a quick idea of what we're up to at the moment. 100 Center Street, done by Senior Life, was a question of actually mentioned preservation. This was a federally funded project from the early 70s, which was going into so-called expiring use, and all the affordables were subject to being lost to the market. We put $1 million into this and saved well over about 150 units at that time, which are now still permanently affordable. St. Aidan's was the conversion of the old church and rectory, and the town put a combination of over $6 million, partly the Housing Trust and partly state and federal subsidies, to produce a combination of rental and ownership new affordable units on this site, 36 out of 59 units, while the church, the old church edifice was higher priced market rate units. And on the right, for those that remember, the legendary Copper Beech tree, which became a part of the project and adds to its attractiveness. Olmsted Hill, as I mentioned, developed by New Atlantic, Bill Nance and Harvey, sitting in the back there. Maybe a rare case where many folks think that the affordable housing part of this project is actually more attractive than the market rate part of the project. The couple of the McMansions on the left and the affordable housing on the right, which was designed to fit in with the architectural themes of Fisher Hill. To look like a turn-of-the-century shingle mansion, but inside this particular building has 14 affordable condominium units, and there are 24 in a total of 3 buildings on that site. Dummer Street, which is down in extreme North Brookline, behind Com Avenue, near the Egmont Street DHA existing properties. This was developed by, it's been not public housing, but a newly formed affiliate of the Public Housing Authority, and we're thrilled to be partnering with them now that they have, after many years, developed the capacity not only to manage affordable housing well, but to actually develop new housing. So this was, again, with leverage funds from different sources, 32 low-income rental units on what was previously a parking lot on that site. Mike, do you remember how many people qualified and were on the waiting list for that lottery? 2,200. Yeah, 2,200 for 32 units. So we are dealing with a bottomless need here. And Then another type, we mentioned SROs on 51 through 7 Beale Street. Our staff waited 10 years to finally have an elderly couple who had run a tire grooming house for most of their lives, finally decided they wanted to leave that business, and we had an agreement with them that the town would get a right of first refusal, at which time we partnered with Pine Street Inn, which does wonderful affordable housing. Got a full rehab of this building, and instead of kind of deteriorated rooms, there are 31 new what are called enhanced lodging house rooms here, because the units now have not only bathrooms but small kitchen units as well. And we think that came out pretty attractively as well. Currently under construction on Harvard Street is Two Life Communities senior rental housing project. Again, with their subsidies brought to the table and the town leveraging it from our sources. That's well under construction. I took a photograph only about 6 weeks ago, and it was just a hole in the ground. But for you, I brought a recent photograph to show you where it is now, if you haven't driven by it recently. I won't, for the sake of time, go through all the print on the right, but we're very excited about the opportunity to create affordable housing from the resources that are going to be created under inclusionary zoning as a result of the development of the main parcel of the Newbury College campus. This is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be interesting for the town and the town meeting in one respect. Our bylaw creates a formal preference that the affordable housing should be created, if not in the project, which was uneconomic, as close as possible. So you're looking at an adjacent parcel at the Newbury College campus, about 7/8 of an acre, with a well, I purposely took an angle that wasn't the most complimentary. Some people have different views about whether this building is attractive, but there's a plan to retain this building as part of an 18-unit affordable housing project there. 15% of the total units that are going to be built across the road, and these would be for sale affordable condominium units. This would require an upzoning of this site by town meeting, but for the purpose of providing a range of possibilities and helping to advance the benefits of the larger project, this will be the first time town meeting is going to be given a choice. This will be the preferred offering for town meeting to choose if it chooses to upzone, and if for any reason this is not upzoned, the Brookline Housing Authority will receive an earmarked allocation from the Housing Trust Fund of $6.5 million. The only other thing that's currently underway, and we're now in the 5th year on this one, and I think this is just about the end. The municipal parking lot over in Brookline Village, right opposite the T-stop, is a pilot project that for developing senior housing over municipal parking lot. If this works, which we think it's going to, we'll be looking at other municipal parking lots. And after quite a few years, with a lot of the HAB members involved, there's a special committee that Heather Hamilton is chairing very well at this point. We have a couple of terrific proposals in response to an RFP that was put out to develop an attractive senior affordable housing project over this. And I'll add that this was the brainchild of Henry Winkleman, who's in the audience, came to us about 5 years ago. Yes? Henry, take a breath for that one. This is great. And last that's going on, we're working with the Brookline Housing Authority on the renovation and renovation and upgrading, serious upgrading of 6 of their projects. We provide revolving funds for the Housing Authority to do with some pre-development work, and we've done that on one project on Park Street. And at present, we've just gotten approval from the trust fund for $1.3 million to do a substantial renovation of this is the headquarters of the Housing Authority. And for those of you in town meeting that heard units being discussed, what might have appeared to be that for the first time, our Housing Authority is a master of micro units. And if you saw them, you think they're pretty good. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. You're up, Paul.
Are we good to go, Carol? I'm Paul Sainer, co-chair of EDAB, and I am pleased to be able to present to you tonight. So what you see on the screen, I'm not going to pretend I can see the screen, and my apologies to the select board for turning my back on you. I'm going to look at the audience. This is our mission statement. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward. We go back to 1995. Our founder was former Superintendent Bob Sperber. Notably, you don't see the word commercial, which is what we're pretty well known for, nor the word residential, which we've actually sponsored several projects for. You can see that the way Bob set this up, our advice goes directly to the town administrator and the select board. There are 12 of us on EDAB, and I believe 11 of us are here tonight. We are a board of primarily real estate professionals. We have architects, we have developers, finance types, and planners, multiples of those. We also have business development, legal, strategic asset planning, and TOD consulting as some of the skill sets on our board. And clearly our board, like the others, has great professional technical expertise to help advise staff and others. My co-chair, Ann Myers, is responsible for the vibrancy of commercial areas, working with the various business organizations in town. But tonight, we're going to talk about development. So the next slide up are the 5 projects that EDAB has sponsored over the last decade. Most of these have already been discussed. I'm not going to talk about the particulars of any of these projects other than 2 are complete, 2 are near completion, and 1, Waldo Durgan, will be entering the regulatory phase over the next 30 days or so. These projects have the following in common. They're all in the TPOD, that's an acronym that Ken missed, the Transit Parking Overlay District. They all had zoning changes based upon a form-based approach to design. They all have had the parking reduced from what had been the minimums as of when these projects went through town meeting. They all come with significant public benefits. They come with tax certainty, which I'll talk about in a minute. And according to Ken Lewis and myself, they will generate, in the first year of stabilized occupancy, they already have or will, so across all 5, a little more than $8 million. Now, there's a lot of people in this room that have been very involved in 4 formal study committees and a 5th informal committee. All of us that have been involved over the last decade know that these projects would not have come to fruition without Sarah Bruton. So how could we wrangle these enhancements out of developers? Well, they needed a zoning change from the town. In the case of Red Cab, we had already passed the zoning change, but we had something that the developer needed in order to be able to implement the zoning, and that is we owned a piece of property that we sold to the developer, and that gave us an angle on treating that developer the same way we were those that were soliciting zoning. I want to just mention that at River Road, has been already discussed, in addition to the hotel, that's the first zoning change that EDAB's been involved with. on a proactive basis, meaning a substantial portion of the industrial triangle was upzoned with the anticipation, especially based upon parcels potentially being assembled over time, that there'll be additional development there beyond the hotel that's already risen out of the ground. So I want to talk a little bit about tax certainty agreements. We, EDAB, for these 5 projects have very long-term, in the last couple of projects, 95-year recorded pilot agreements, payment in lieu of tax agreements that assures that the town will continue to receive taxes regardless of who owns the properties and if they do become an exempt use. This is an innovative structure that hasn't been tested, but it's one that EDAB and the town is very committed to. I should point out that we cannot negotiate enhanced public benefits or tax certainty if the developer applicant is simply looking for zoning relief. That's called contract zoning if we attempted it, and it's blatantly illegal. So the next slide shows why EDAB cares about tax certainty agreements. It shows 850 Boylston Street, which sold last year for $110 million to Brigham and Women's Hospital. This particular property had been the second largest taxpayer in town to 10 Brookline Place. Its taxes were a little less than $2 million, and sure enough, the property sold right before July 1st and right after July 1st. Brigham's applied to the town for tax exemption, which we have granted. However, our town administrator jumped immediately into action, was able to get a pilot agreement for approximately 25% of the taxes. Nonetheless, this particular transaction has the effect of causing everyone else's taxes in town to go up by 85 basis points, a little less than 1%. Now, what I don't have on the screen is a picture of 730 Com Ave, which sold within the last month to Boston University, another major office building, $52 million of assessed value, $800,000 of taxes, and I fully expect that BU will include this in their exemption application come July 1st of this year. But I also fully expect that BU will include this in their pilot program to the town. So the next 4 slides are a series of slides relating to BFAC. I'm going to go through these very quickly. There are a number of former members of BFAC here tonight, including myself. And the first slide that you're going to see, I am not even going to come close to explaining. It's got 4 different quadrants that depict, in 3 of those, issues that were of significant concern to BFAC around the fiscal condition of the town. One is a structural operating gap that's growing over time. The second is a significant increase in debt associated with capital projects. The third is our reserves were less than what our policy was, but the town administrator, pursuant to his budget, has already proposed a solution to partially close that gap. The fourth quadrant is what those other 3 impact, which is the town's AAA credit rating. Next slide, please. This slide is a very high-level summary of BFAC's 18 recommendations. These recommendations are proactive, multi in nature, and are sustainable only if they sort of work as a package. You can see the 4 sections into which the 18 categories were slotted. Next slide. One of the 18 recommendations was expanded economic development. This was a priority recommendation of BFAC. One of the other credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, includes economic development amongst the top 10 management characteristics of a well-run municipality. You can see on this slide the specific recommendation around a vibrant local economy generating new tax growth, all designed to try to make Brookline slightly less unaffordable to those of us that are fortunate to live here. Not on this slide are some companion recommendations around new economic development, specifically the need for consulting, the need for a continuation of long-term strategic planning, the specific recommendation around a select board member being responsible for the economic development portfolio, and last but not least, critical importance of public education. The next slide was a slide that BFAC requested of EDAB to try to frame choices. Specifically, we asked how much new commercial square footage would need to be developed to support the debt service to build a new $100 million school. Well, surely I couldn't answer that question, but Ken Lewis could and did. And you can see that the answer is 465,000 square feet. That assumes that we go out and float bonds for 25 years, which has been sort of the traditional borrowing term. It also assumes an interest rate that's considerably more than what the town's present cost of borrowing is. This analysis is based upon present market conditions for 4 different commercial property types. You can read them. But this is highly hypothetical. The reason is we don't have the zoning in place to do any of this. We don't have sufficient FAR, and in particular, we don't allow biolabs in town. The next slide is a series of slides. Sergio Modigliani, who's a friend of many of ours, is out of the country tonight. But over the years, I've heard Sergio talk about why is it that most of the mass along Beacon Street is outside of the commercial areas. He talked about so-called single-story temporary taxpayer structures that were constructed in the first couple of decades of the 20th century when Beacon Street was first being developed. And I turned to my friend and very notable preservation historian Carla Banca to research this, and she came up with 19 different taxpayer structures that are made out of concrete stone for the most part, up and down Beacon Street. So these show 3 of those buildings. And Carla also in her research, and I'd love to have a whole session on this, Ken, the history of zoning in town, pointed out to me that the FAR at one time along Beacon Street was 4.0. It's now at best 2.0. That's the maximum FAR for any G district in town. The maximum multifamily district is 2.5. So the fact that prior to the early 70s it was 4.0 explains why outside of the central commercial areas along Beacon Street we tend to see a lot of larger 1960 type apartment buildings. The next slide shows a couple of as of right developments, and by as of right I mean, I got to be really careful because I'm with a lot of planners here, organic development that occurred without a zoning change. And these are examples of what we got. These happen to be along Route 9, and they're rather sort of automobile oriented. And again, there's no incentive under zoning for a property owner to do much bigger. In fact, and I don't have a picture of this up, over the 25 years of VDAB, the only significant commercial organic development that I know of is 1285 Beacon Street. It was built 15 years ago to the max of 1.75, and I heard for about 8 years thereafter about the financial difficulties that the owner of that building had to endure. Okay, so now we're going to turn to a rather dense-looking slide that talks about what I believe to be coming out of BFAC, one of the most significant challenges that the town faces, which is zoning reform. I want to start by saying that it's often said that all the big project opportunities are gone. We got the big five. I don't believe that. I can think of at least 5 major pure commercial sites that would be prime for redevelopment. And unlike the 5 big projects from last decade, 3 of which weren't even assembled sites a decade ago, all 5 of these have sufficient size to warrant commercial development. We have, through the economic development planning staff, a very robust 5-year plan that calls for systematic studies of our mixed-use commercial corridor, starting with Lower Route 9. And the objective that I think should be followed is, again, using form-based zoning approaches. What incentives can be put into place through zoning changes, which will require densification, I got to use that word, the D word, to create the opportunity for proactive development in areas of town that are either underbuilt or, even for this blind person, pretty butt ugly to have to think about. So the slide shows how these corridor-wide studies can support town objectives around economic development, housing affordability, including affordable housing, sustainability, transportation should probably be up there, and definitely diversity. Certainly one of the goals would be to create more opportunities for ground-level small business entrepreneurs. We have some existing tools to build off of, starting with the fact that we have a great location that's very desirable. We've got a housing production plan that's in danger of having dust settle on it. It's been around since 2016. That is, in my view, something that should very much be considered as we systematically study these corridors for upzoning. While it's terrific that we've got about 100 units of inclusionary zoning, we have, I think, much greater opportunities if we can get the zoning right in our mixed-use corridors. I already referenced the 5-year economic development plan. And then, thanks to Linda Pelkey, Article 15 last fall, we do have the benefit, at least on the commercial side, of no longer having parking minimums. And I'm going to wish Michael Zuroff good luck in his quest to accomplish the same within the T-Pod for residential parking, a warrant article that we'll be, I guess, looking at in a few months. The next slide lists some of our challenges around proactive zoning, and including first and foremost that the physical characteristics of a lot of sites in town are very small, without a lot of depth. Some of them are almost nearly impossible to get a car to be able to get in and out of, never mind park And so we also have a number of property owners that have owned their property for a long time that have a low tax basis. So one of the ways to move forward is with more, same words, density through zoning, creating incentives, and the challenges that we face in so doing are that for upper level commercial uses to be viable anywhere, they need a certain standard size floor plate that, for a lot of the sites can only be achieved if there is the incentive to aggregate smaller parcels to qualify for more zoning if they're applied for as one parcel. Housing is always the highest and best use. Housing very much wants to be in the upper levels in our commercial area. Housing has a tendency to want to crowd out the commercial area. When I looked a year ago, 14 of the then 1440Bs, half of them were built in commercial zones, to make that point. The other side of the coin relative to multifamily is that from a tax point of view, it's the lowest paying. Well, how can that be if he just said it's highest and best use? Well, it's because of what Ben mentioned in his opening. Commercial taxes are 64% greater than real estate taxes. Another challenge that we face, and it should be evident even though it's a late hour, if we, through zoning, build on sites for large-scale commercial developments, there's always the chance, like on Boylston Street or like on Com Ave, those properties someday could be purchased by a nonprofit and could no longer be paying taxes. So we also obviously have challenges, quite appropriately so, around what impacts residents will feel from density. You can see some of those listed. Another challenge is around public education. If you're going to create incentive under zoning, you need to embrace the fact that it's actually a good thing for developers to want to make money in our town, because if they do it in a way that is channeled towards pursuing our town objectives, we really need to be able to attract that private equity to make changes in our commercial corridors. The last slide is of Newbury College. I'm putting this up here for three reasons. One, I can hardly wait for the warrant to close and the opportunity for the many town meeting members that are here tonight and others to read about this package of 7 warrant articles. There's been a lot written about Newbury over the last couple of weeks on the TMMA listserv, and this will level set everyone on exactly what the deal is. Secondly, I have it up here because I guess there is a chicken in every pot. This encompasses planning, preservation, economic development, certainly affordable housing, and absolutely sustainability. The last reason I have this slide up here is I've had lunch with everybody on this panel other than Dave King, and oftentimes more than once. And the last time I had lunch with Steve Hyken, we talked about the value of the town's major parcel study and how we really need to more actively work that tool. There are more Newbury colleges out there, and so I want to close by drawing your attention to the BFAC quote at the bottom of this slide. Economic development, by its very nature, is complex. It requires a robust and opportunistic long-term planning process. Thank you for your time.
Next up is preservation, and I leave it to these gentlemen to divide their time.
Good evening. I'm David King, Chair of the Preservation Commission. We're a regulatory body overseeing local historic districts and National Register properties in Brookline. These are our members. I've been chair for 5 years. I'm an architect in Boston, have been on the commission for about 10 years. With me is Elton Elprin, who's vice chair, also an architect, and has been on the commission for about 20 years. Also, other members include Jim Batchelor, a former chair who's also an architect, Wendy Ecker, retired real estate agent, David Jack, who came to us through his work in creating the Crown and Shield Local Historic District, Rick Pensiera, architect, Peter Kleiner, architect, Elizabeth Armstrong, who is our attorney. There are 8 local historic districts which were established by bylaw 5.6. They appear purple on the map, and a number of places listed on the National Register which appear green and yellow. We oversee alterations in these areas, particularly changes brought about by renovations or additions to buildings in the local historic districts. We use the framework of our design guidelines. We also enforce Article 5.3, the demolition bylaw. Demolition cases which are judged initially significant by staff and the chair are brought before the commission. If the quorum of the commission upholds the finding, the demolition is delayed by 1 year. Applicants sometimes wait out the say, but more often they end up working with the commission in subcommittee to find a solution more sympathetic to the preservation of the property, and the stay is lifted before the year expires.
These are our much-loved local historic district guidelines. They set out the scope of our work, the limit of our authority in local historic districts, and they give specific preservation direction to the preservation of the exterior of buildings, as listed here, these sorts of elements. They also address our applications for fences and walls, although not landscaping. They speak to requests for demolition, either partial or sometimes, rarely, but sometimes full demolition of buildings and LHDs, and new construction. Also rare that new construction is a freestanding building. It's usually an addition, but sometimes is a freestanding building. This is a slide that shows examples of commonly, very frequently seen requests for replacement of gutters, sometimes in alternate materials to the existing. Lots of requests for fences. We require that all applications be accompanied by dimensioned drawings that call out materials. A lot of condenser applications, and they're going to be more now, I think, after the bylaw passed, somewhat more in LHDs. This house illustrates a place in which the original application was for an exterior conduit, and we worked with as we usually do, work with the applicant to a better solution, running it internally. Next 2 slides are about a fairly important case, major case in the Chestnut Hill Local Historic District. In the scale of things that we deal with, there's the application for a new garage joined to the existing house. We frown upon joining garages to houses in local historic districts because it's not really the historic practice, but we worked with the owner and their architect over a period of several meetings on this, and we arrived at a compromise in which the connection's 1-story rather than 2-story. The garage is somewhat simplified. the additional bay and storage area is reduced, and we think it fits better in the neighborhood and the characteristics of the districts. Next slide. In addition to that, during the same process, the owners wanted to and were encouraged to restore a number of elements that have been torn from the original building. This is the original building, pretty wonderful shingle-style building, and over the years, as you see from this before picture, building when the applicants bought it, it had lost its dormer, its bay, the balustrade, its old window, et cetera, the porch. So several of those elements were restored by the owner in the process. So we achieved something while compromising something. New dormer, oval window, bay, and balustrade.
This is the core house. The core house is an example which demonstrates the breadth of different types of architecture in Brookline. This is a 1950s house by the architect Edward Coitera. Was conceived of as a modular prototype, a central utility core around which flat roof post and beam house with structural panels could be constructed. It was part of a group of 4 mid-century houses in the middle of the Pill Hill local historic district. The owner needed to sell it, but the house looked like a summer bungalow amongst larger and more expensive houses. They applied for a demolition permit. The Preservation Commission argued for keeping the house and adding to it, which is eventually what happened. The drawings on the left are of the original house. The drawings on the right show are sketches of the house with the addition. The buyer was from Brookline and moved from a much larger Victorian house. Their architect created a very sensitive addition, which was sympathetic to the original product, but easily distinguishable as an addition as well. This is another house of the same period where we worked with the architect and the owner. The architect actually is Linda Hamlin of the Planning Board. The architect played off the geometry of the original building to create a complementary addition while preserving the original house.
So I said it's rare that there's application to build new houses in local historic districts, but this is one of those. There was a large empty lot on the site. We worked for a year and a half with a subcommittee with the owner, the architect, and a group of very engaged neighbors. They were engaged partly because the original proposal was to build 2 buildings, each with 2 units on the same site, very close to Walnut Street, all the way back to the back of the site. And of course, they preferred more open space. We did 2, and we worked with them for that year and a half to come to this design shown in this photo as built. 2 units in 1 building set way back on the site, which is somewhat lower than the Walnut Street itself, with a shared driveway with the abutting neighboring house and parking that's concealed at the back of the house. So we think that the ultimate effect, the house in its, its forms and its location on the site and the broad porch on the front fits in pretty well with neighboring houses.
This is a demolition application. We worked with the building department to develop diagrams to help the staff determine what exactly constitutes partial demolition. And if an architect or owner wants to add a dormer or a small addition like a mudroom, he or she can use these diagrams to design the project so it will not trigger partial demolition.
Coolidge Corner Theater, you all know it. It was actually the first case that came before the Preservation Commission in Brookline. It was built, building was built in 1906 as Universalist Church. converted to an Art Deco movie theater, or added movie theater in 1933. But by the late 80s, the theater was failing financially. The owner sold to a developer. The developer's intention was to gut the theater and develop it, the building commercially on the interior. The Brookline Coolidge Corner Theater Foundation was formed to try to save the theater, and the Preservation Commission imposed a stay of demolition. In the time of that stay, the foundation raised money, but time was running out. They had not raised enough, and at the last moment, Harold Brown stepped in. His Hamilton Charitable Foundation bought the building and leased it to the Theater Foundation for 99 years, and that's why we have a building, a movie theater here today. This is just to show it's not always residential either, that this is a fairly typical case of a demolition application in which we could save, with the cooperation of the owner and the architect, we could save the facade. The original proposal, I mean, this is structurally decaying and in general falling apart. It's on Station Street, a unique, unusual facade that's actually connected to that building in the back. Really unique condition. And they wanted to keep it one story, and they proposed this design. We thought it was okay, but not too much of a departure from the existing form. And through a couple of rounds of working with them, we arrived at this design, which is not yet constructed, which retains a lot of the elements and sort of echoes the rhythm of the existing building. Loses some of the elements, a little single pane diamond glass, but refers to it in the fenestration of the clear stories. And St. Aidan's, which you all know has been referred to tonight, you probably all know also is a family church of Kennedy's. JFK and 4 siblings were christened here, baptized here. The church was no longer used as a church. I think it was in 2001 when the Archdiocese proposed to build a complex of 140 units of housing. I think more than 36 were affordable. I forget how many, 50-something. 36 was? So anyway, that proposal of 140 was going to demolish the open space, demolish this existing beech tree, and a neighborhood organization, Campaign to Preserve St. Aidan's, was formed. The Preservation Commission again put a stay on demolition. In that time that passed, with the cooperation and work of the campaign, the commission, the Archdiocese, we arrived at a compromise again in which housing is built, open space is preserved. There's actually a conservation restriction preserving the open space, as well as a preservation restriction preserving the form, most of the exterior form of the church. And housing was built that we think, which I think has 36 units of affordable housing, which we think fits the scale of the neighborhood fairly well, both in the Masonry building here on Pleasant Street and the wood building that you see between the Masonry building and the church beyond on Crown and Shield Road.
We are currently reviewing local historic guidelines in subcommittee. In addition, we prepared design guidelines for projects on Harvard Street because we were asked to evaluate projects on Harvard through the demo delay process, and we had no parameters with which to consider the proposed designs. Subsequently, we asked the Planning Commission to join us in preparing design guidelines for Beacon Street as well. Both are critical areas of Brookline that are under development pressure. We have also applied for a survey and planning grant for the area around Linden Street in Brookline. and at town meeting in 2018, we presented a warrant article proposing that a demolition permit be valid only with respect to the owner of record, so applicants would not be encouraged to apply for demo delay when they simply wanted to sell the property. And the warrant passed unanimously. And we also participate on DATs. Several years ago, we revised our guidelines to accommodate renewable energy, and we believe preservation and energy conservation go hand in hand. We recognize the urgency of addressing climate change in a comprehensive way, including considering the embodied energy of existing building elements. We also recognize there is a housing shortage in Brookline. We sometimes work with developers on new projects and LHDs. We're not against development, but for well thought out development. We are evolving in our positions regarding some materials like wood gutters and steel windows. It's not our intent to be dogmatic, but nevertheless to do our best to be good stewards of preservation for the historical properties of the town. Thank you.
And last but not least, Werner Lowy on behalf of the Climate Action Committee.
Thank you very much. And you can check your watches. It's going to be between 10 and 12 minutes for those of you who are approaching the bedtime. So first of all, I was pleased that even though the name of our committee is the Select Board's Climate Action Committee, that it only refers to climate, that Ken asked me to talk about environmental sustainability. And I'm going to take advantage of that, I think, and try to talk about the basics of the committee, but also go beyond that and talk a little bit about the climate movement in general in Brookline, and maybe even try to get us all to think a little farther in the future than we normally do. So the Select Board's Climate Action Committee is 15 people appointed by the Select Board. There they are. It has roughly equal numbers of members who are delegates from town boards and others who are environmental activists of one sort or another. It's a little hard to read, and you can, if you really care about exactly who's who, I gather this is going to be on the website. We meet once a month. We have a quite broad range of people. It seems like architects and lawyers are everywhere, but we all think we do a good job, right? The heart of our mission is in the climate action plan that is approved by the Select Board. Its goal is to have zero emissions. That is absolutely no greenhouse gas emissions, either from the town or from the community by 2050. But also included in that is adapting to climate change, educating the public, and monitoring and reporting. Beyond that, because the Climate Action Committee is a little unusual, and because it's only 10 years old, I'm going to spend a minute to talk about its history. This will also be on the website. It's hard to read here, so I've broken it up into pieces. This is sort of the histories. Compared to many towns, Brookline has moved very quickly on climate change. In the year 2000, all in 1 year, after a public forum at the Coolidge Corner Theater, Climate Action Brookline was founded. The Select Board formally recognized climate change, and 3 climate change warrant articles were introduced to town meeting. But we did start small. I mean, the first concrete step was a resolution encouraging the town to buy 2 Priuses. There's a big fight about whether it should be 1 or 3. But that was a long time ago. And as you can see from the photo, by now, Priuses are routine. Then in 2008, activists in Climate Action Brookline, the volunteer group, took a big step and passed a warrant article requiring the Select Board to establish the Select Board's Climate Action Committee. It then sponsored a number of important initiatives, among them adoption of the stretch code, the state stretch code, a municipal energy reduction plan, and also 2 programs for residents, Solarize Brookline and Brookline Green Electricity. In the last 3 years, or 4 years, however you want to look at it, we've, I think, become more ambitious and creative. And in addition, I think Brookline has really become recognized around the state as a leader on building issues. First, we saw the 9th school as an opportunity, and we formed the Net Zero 9th School Subcommittee and dug as deeply as we could into the sustainability issues around that. And out of that work came town meetings, Net Zero 9th School resolution, which went well beyond LEED standards to establish EUI standards, in other words, energy use intensity standards. And then also because of that research, probably the most important thing in some ways that's happened in the last 10 or 20 years in a way is we and a few other places in the world, we were among the first really in thinking this through to realize that the goal that we've all been focusing on for the last 10 or 20 years, which energy efficiency, while it's certainly important, isn't enough, that what we need to do is stop burning fossil fuels entirely. And, or put another way, that our goal needs to be zero emissions. In a way, town meeting got out ahead of us and picked up on that idea, maybe from the report, maybe from talking to people, and first required that new schools be fossil fuel free, and then passed Article 21, which somebody referred to before here, so that we became the first community on the East Coast to ban fossil fuel infrastructure in new construction. By the way, somebody mentioned before, that is still pending in front of the AG's office waiting for approval, and we really have no idea when that will be. Could be tomorrow, could be July, but actually, in all honesty, we're hoping it'll be slower rather than quicker, because when Springtown meeting season passes, there could be as many as half a dozen other communities that follow our lead, some of them actually just using our language, and we think that if that happens, the idea of something surviving and being approved by the AG increases. So the Climate Action Committee takes this idea of leadership seriously too, because climate change is so complicated. It's important that we support other people, and practically everybody in a community like this, at least, cares about climate change, but can't be as focused as we are. So we really try to work with people. And, I mean, in fact, the Warren Article 21 wasn't really a Climate Action Committee sponsored thing. It was, we supported it, but Jesse Gray, town meeting member, led the proposal. Raul and Heather were among 9 sponsors of it. So 3 members of the Select Board's Climate Action Committee were sponsors. And we think that kind of approach and working teams that we've organized, for instance, Scott Ananian has been doing a huge amount of work lobbying, following things at the state level to try to strengthen the state building code. And again, it's not officially our initiative, but we're working closely with it. And closer to home, right here, Paul Sainer and Sergio Mendigliani and Ken Lewis and Kara Bruton and others did a great job of taking the idea that we developed about standards for energy use intensity and incorporating them and a number of other really green things, as Paul said, in the Waldo Durgan agreement. So we really do feel that we're working together on this. We're trying to move beyond the low-hanging fruit and use the creative energy that we have here in Brookline. We think we can sometimes influence people even beyond our borders, but also work on really being a model for the private sector. Collectively, all of us in this room are really among the town leaders, and we need to work together to do that. I guess we all know our world is facing big problems. And it's not just climate change, it's new diseases, it's plastics in the food chain, it's poverty, immigration, mass migration. And what we don't always think about, I don't think as much as we should, is we have an economic system that's not only based on inequality, but it's also based on endless and ultimately unsustainable growth. All of us here certainly are busy with day-to-day responsibilities, which are clearly important. But as we're looking at developers' proposals and listening to residents and recognizing that we have some influence in this world, I'd like to think that we can also try to think beyond that. Can we look at the bigger picture and really look far ahead? Can we in small ways start to address the really alarming things in the future that we really would prefer to ignore? There are certainly some groundbreaking things we can agree upon. We've already seen pictures of Balfour on top of Fisher Hill. It should be easy to agree that more all-electric developments like this are the kind of thing that will attract more quality developers to Brookline and keep us a leader statewide. But we also need to take on the controversial issues. The most obvious one is if we want housing to be affordable and local businesses to thrive and neighborhoods to be more livable, as well as fighting climate change. But one of the most important things for fighting climate change is convincing people in town that we need to build more densely. But at the same time, can we think really big, again, on the really big long-term issues? For instance, how many people realize that St. Mary's is only 13 feet above sea level? Should we be designing buildings that can be disassembled and moved to higher ground? Can we come up with entirely new forms of economic development? Ones that don't just rely on real estate development? Are there new forms of economic development that can sustain a no growth or stable state economy 50 years from now? I mean, where do we even start to try to think about an issue that big? But on the other hand, if we, places like Brookline, don't think about issues like that, who will? But I'll leave you with that and try and get back to the present, in that our next tasks, immediate tasks, are big enough. Their next task probably is to come up with ways of retrofitting old buildings so that they're all electric. How do we do that? Do we require energy efficiency or even fossil fuel-free upgrades? When do we do that? Do we do it at the time of sale? Do we use incentives? What do we do? But in addition, what sort of development do we incentivize or require? Can we require on-site electricity generation or storage? What can we do to make sure, someone else I was pleased to hear mention, that how do we make sure that construction uses low embedded carbon materials? Do we think, for instance, how many builders in Brookline know that there's new concrete that they can use that sequesters carbon? And again, last but not least, can we build more densely? But beyond that, how can we be more transformative? For instance, on Martha's Vineyard, they've built a co-housing development that's not, it's co-housing, it's affordable housing, and it's a model environmental community. In Amsterdam, they're building a self-sufficient eco-village. Maybe we could build microthermal districts in Brookline. That is block-by-block district heating and cooling networks using geothermal wells dug in the streets. I'm not really sure, but I think we all should be thinking about that sort of thing. And what I really would like to hear from all of us is, as leaders, what do we think our vision for the future should be? Thank you.
So I know the hour is late, but I think it was really important that we gave the boards and commissions some time to describe what they're up to and what they're thinking about in the future, and to talk about their makeup and the types of folks that are represented. We're at our second question and answer period, and I think we've got time for one or two questions. I don't know if there are note cards floating out there. I'll ask a rapid fire question. So we've talked a lot about internal conversations in Brookline and what each of us and our boards and commissions are focused on, but we're also impacted by exterior forces, and something that's gotten a lot of coverage in the globe over recent years, and it's getting more and more coverage as the legislative session ends, is the governor's housing reform legislation. I'm wondering if each of you can just go around quickly and talk about maybe some way that legislation, which amongst other things decreases the level of approval at town meeting to make a zoning change, that seeks to incentivize and perhaps even promote the creation of additional housing units, and make some additional changes to state programs. How does that legislation, that pending legislation, affect each of your committees and the work that you're doing today? Why don't we start with you, Steve?
Well, certainly, I would like to see that legislation passed. It's been frustrating. It seems like for some people it doesn't go far enough, and for others it goes too far, so it's been stuck in the middle. But lowering the bar to change zoning from a 2/3 majority to 50% would make it much more possible to modify the zoning and allow for increases in density that a number of us have talked about. There have been several occasions where, for instance, several years ago, the attempt to allow for accessory dwelling units, which is another way of creating additional housing without a huge build-out in town, missed a 2/3 vote by a couple of votes, and more recently it came back and it did pass. But there are a lot of things that I think we would like to see happen that would be more achievable with the housing choice bill and the rezoning in place.
Yes, the housing choice bill, the governor's been pushing it. It's had a lot of support in the legislature. It will eventually pass. It's not clear what's holding it up at the moment. There was a period of time when the reluctance of the Mass Municipal Association to get behind the bill was appeared to be the main impediment, but they seem to have at least acquiesced about a year ago now. And we've supported it. I know I've spoke to a couple of our reps at one point when it looked like it was about to pass, but it's kind of a puzzle at the moment. What's hanging it up? It would be a huge lifting of an impediment. I mean, it's a national challenge as well as here in Massachusetts and Brookline with regard to the inability to rezone where it's needed and to get good density increases where it's needed. So we're still hoping it will pass and it will be a boon to housing production and affordable housing in particular.
I'm really not informed about the housing choice bill, but going to what Steve was talking about with accessible units, I know that other communities around in the general area like Lexington have, especially in historic districts, allowed historic accessible units because there are very large historic houses where older couples want to age in place and the house is simply too big for them. So I think that's a good idea, and that will help the preservation of these larger houses in historic districts.
Paul?
I'll just simply add that I'm for it, and that when I last read the proposed legislation, it was more than housing. It would absolutely apply to mixed-use rezoning in the corridors that are such an integral part of the economic development plan.
I wasn't aware of this legislation, actually, I'm ashamed to say, and I will read up on it. I'm certainly in support of a lot of the kind of upzoning, rezoning, form-based zoning, we're having conversations about that now. And I've been designing accessory dwelling units in those for some of the towns where it's been permitted. So I'm very much approving more density in the interest of climate change.
Yeah, I would say from a climate action point of view, what it's all about is getting people to embrace change rather than resist it. And if this can help do that, then it's a good thing.
So I've feverishly been trying to keep notes on everything that I heard tonight, and we'll see how well I listened. So let me just quickly go through here in no particular order. So one of the most interesting things I heard, I think this came from Paul, was that today's zoning rules aren't necessarily holdovers from the early 20th century. I heard that staff is very busy and that accommodating warrant articles and some of the citizen-led initiatives comes at the expense of some of the evergreen work that needs to happen. I heard that boards and commissions are working on both residential and commercial developments and proposals, and some of that work is occurring on boards and commissions that I think of actually focusing on the inverse. And by that I mean EDAB is starting to increasingly think about residential development, and the Preservation Commission is focusing on commercial development. So that was interesting to me. I heard that while we may be at a 10% SHI, that's not a reason to just say no. We should think about the relative merits of a proposed project and see where the conversation leads us. I heard that there's a lot of cross-cutting conversations and activity taking place. I'll note that the Housing Advisory Board and Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations are holding a forum in the next couple of weeks. I heard that there were reserved seats on some of these boards and commissions that have spoken tonight for each other. So the HAB and the Climate Action Committee has seats reserved for members of the Preservation Commission or the Planning Board or EDAB. I heard that the CAC is increasingly thinking of itself as a consultant of sorts to other groups in town and trying to provide subject matter expertise. I heard that development takes place, but maybe development takes time, but we get to good results. And a couple of specific projects were highlighted. So Cleveland Circle was something that took a couple of years, but it seems like we got a good project. 20 Boylston Street, and as of right development took some time and process, but we've gotten to a good end result, as we did with 54 Auburn and the St. Aidan's projects. My last little sheet here, I promise. I heard that there's talent on boards and commissions and a lot of institutional and professional knowledge. I heard that there's a lot of proactive planning taking place across the groups that we heard from tonight. And I heard that there's financial impacts to the work that we all are doing every day. 850 Boylston and the recent acquisition on Commonwealth Avenue were highlighted as the impacts of a nonprofit purchasing commercial property, a tax-paying property. And I heard that there's the choice between residential and commercial development and approvals has a financial impact as well, particularly in regards to the tax shift. All right, so let's talk about next steps. So you see a slide here that there's a quiz with the lofty goal of free admission to a development board meeting of your choice in the future. Having sat in a couple of those meetings before, it's a enthralling experience and worth the price of admission. So in all seriousness, I think we're all better informed about development tonight. And I think we all have a better sense of what boards and commissions are and what they're doing and what they have been doing and what they will be doing. I think I'm at least better informed about where mission overlap exists and where coordination and collaboration is possible and would be fruitful. And I've also got a better sense of what the trends we're seeing are in Brookline, both at the macro level across town, but also at the micro level on individual boards and commissions. I hope that this conversation continues over the weeks and months ahead, and let me propose 3 ways that I think that that conversation could continue, and how tonight can be the seeds of a beautiful tree that blossoms in the future. One, I'd love to see this forum become an annual summit, and I'll propose that the leadership, the coordination of the forum rotate between boards and commissions, maybe with a topic determined by the host. So the ZBA may host in the future to talk about materials that might be helpful to them as they think about adjudicating cases and the form in which those materials come. Or the CAC could host to solicit, conversation and thoughts about what climate resilient design looks like and how we can most effectively do that. I would encourage boards and commissions to begin collaborating, even more so than they are today, on shared topics of interest. And the power of personal connection. Continue those conversations that you started over hors d'oeuvres, over a cup of coffee, and see where it leads. I want to put a plug in for diversity. I think that government functions best when all perspectives and opinions are represented. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure everybody's voice across Brookline is heard, and that we do our best to make that happen. And let me propose 2 ways that you do that. To re-examine and think about intentionally how you reach out to those affected by the conversations that your boards and commissions are having, and how you make people aware of what you're talking about, and give them the opportunity to influence outcomes. I would encourage you to be intentional about when selecting a meeting location, for example. So when you talk about a demolition delay on a parcel, why not schedule a session at a housing authority property, for example? And I want to take the opportunity to push you to take advantage of opportunities to diversify, boards and commissions in terms of racial and ethnic heritage and cultural background and perspective and expertise and even skills. Obviously, the select board is responsible for appointing the boards and commissions on which you sit, but set us up for success, and keep this as a conversation about people in your professional networks that you think would be great to bring onto boards and commissions, and feed us applicants that allow us to showcase the best of Brookline, and again, expand that conversation to all voices within town. I want to give everybody here a round of applause for a late night, but I think a fruitful start to a conversation, which again, I hope will blossom in the future. And with that, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention, and most importantly, thank you for all you do for the town.
Thank you.